And joining us here today, pleased to have with us back on the program, Curt Covington with AgAmerica. Curt, always great to catch up with you, sir. Hope you're doing well.
Thank you. It's great to see you again, Jesse.
Thanks for the time. Let's dive in. I want to talk here just about the state of this farm economy and really the economy in general. But overall, we've touched on this before, Curt. Obviously, there is a lot of growing food demand around the world, and there is a big crop going into the ground here this year. Probably the most expensive crop that U.S. farmers have ever planted. So as you look at things now as we're getting into the heart of spring planting season, what's the latest update? Has anything changed in your mind with the outlook for just this ag economy in general right now?
I'm expecting the 2023 ag economy to be relatively strong. There's going to be pockets where there's going to be potentially some profitability issues, and most of those tend to be in specialty crops. We've seen, for the most part, the crops that you would see out west, there's been some stress in many of those commodities, mostly because of overproduction. But when it comes to Midwest corn and soybeans and wheat, I think the economy is appearing to be for 2023. It looks like it's going to be another decent year. All of that said, right, it becomes kind of a microscopic view of how each farmer planned their input costs for 2023, right? And, there's always this challenge come the fall and come wintertime. On the one hand, they're making decisions about how they are going to manage their tax liability. Mm-hmm. So they're prepaying their fertilizer and other input costs. And on the other hand, they've got the banker who they have to negotiate with to get their operating lines renewed. But ultimately, I think in general, even though input costs remain somewhat relatively elevated, I think it's going to be a pretty decent year in 2023.
You brought up the operating loans, and that is something that I really wanted to ask you about because obviously we're hearing with the inflationary environment, the cost of money is getting more and more expensive, and we're seeing these recent bank failures and more. As you look at the ag economy, we look at farmers and some of those operating needs that they have to have in their operation. How is that outlook? Should there be any concern from farmers and ranchers just with the recent bank failures we've seen and this cost of money getting more and more expensive? What's your thoughts there, Curt?
Yeah, I think rural community banks still remain very strong. I think what we saw with Silicon Valley Bank and a couple others in that sector was really more focused on probably some bad management practices of those banks. I mean, ultimately, that's how I would describe it. But rural community banks, for the most part, are very strong. They're very well managed and are committed to serving their farmers' needs. All that said, Jesse, the cost of borrowing money for your operating line has doubled since this time last year. It's doubled. And you say, well, interest cost is the cost of renting money. But it now has become, in the past, for the prior 10 years, the cost of borrowing money was basically free. Mm-hmm. They were very close to free. So you could afford higher other input costs, fertilizer, chemicals, labor. You could manage it. But in today's environment, labor costs remain high. Fertilizer costs have come down somewhat. Chemical costs remain elevated. And in some parts of the world, water costs in the United States remain elevated. But when you double the cost of borrowing money, it makes it significantly more difficult for those farmers to make a profit. And so for me, ultimately it is that farmers have to determine this year, and I've said this before, but 2023 is the bellwether year on this. You've got to decide what your wants are and what your needs are.
Well, and I would think too, if you decide what your wants and needs are, you go in to sit down with your banker, that's going to help your position even more because we've heard some talk, at least for consumers, that it's getting harder and harder to obtain credit in this environment. I wonder, is that the case for some farmers? Is it getting harder and harder for them to obtain credit, or have we not seen necessarily that kind of impact on farmers and ranchers, Curt?
Generally speaking, all the farmers and I talk to farmers across the U.S. on a regular basis for the most part, and some of this is anecdotal, but some of it is just direct conversations with banks and farmers. Banks have money to lend. They're over deposited at this point. They've got the money to lend. The cost of that money has gone up.
Mhm.
Ultimately, it's up to the borrower to show his banker that even at these higher interest rates that they can make the budget work, so to speak. That being said, I have not heard of any real significant issue. We've had a couple of non-traditional lenders that have left the market. I don't want to get into all that detail, but
Yeah.
there's one major one that kind of left the market. So it's stranded some borrowers at the worst time of year when you're trying to renew your line of credit. But I have some of those customers, but they've all successfully gone out and obtained financing.
Well, Curt, great thoughts. And of course, as we've alluded to, it's going to be a bellwether year, as you put it. A lot of things to keep our eyes on. Of course, we're also watching just the commodity markets in general, and how things around the globe are looking and playing into our entire economy. Any thoughts with just how you're seeing the world events, geopolitical events, anything like that, the outside markets, anything there that you're keeping an eye on, Curt?
Ultimately, the United States um, is traditionally been a large exporter of their commodities, whether that's corn, beans, traditional commodities, powdered milk, or whether it's specialty crops. The exchange rates in many of these countries has made it much more difficult to export into those markets. The strength of the US dollar has made it. And I think that's one of the things we sometimes just forget about is there's some commodities, and I don't need to go across all the sectors, but there's some commodities that over 60, 70% of those commodities are exported. And so you're not relying on domestic consumption. You're relying on export consumption of many of these commodities, and it's a challenge. That being said, I think we're starting to see some of the markets open up, and what's good for the global economy when it comes to commodities is really good for the U.S. economy and good for the American farmer.
Well, Curt, great thoughts. And I know, of course, AgAmerica, you guys have a lot of different lending options, a lot of assets available to help farmers and ranchers with any of their needs. Before we let you go, any final thoughts on your mind here as we watch just the state of this farm economy right now?
No, I think, look, these are the times where, in my opinion, you separate the great managers in agriculture from the ones that aren't thinking ahead and strategically thinking, okay, I'm coming into a period of transition. Look at the dairy sector. You see the grain commodity prices remain relatively strong, but you're starting to see some slippage there. Now is the time where you have to start thinking about what's going to happen in 2024 and beyond. You can't be in the moment now on everything. Some of this has to be as, okay, this could be the last year for a period of time where I have reasonably good profits. What am I going to do with those profits in 2023 to set myself up for perhaps a weakening of the ag economy in 2024 and beyond?
Well, great thoughts. And of course, we'll stay in touch and talk with you as we work through the year ahead. Folks can also learn more agamerica.com with that. Curt Covington from AgAmerica. Always appreciate the time, sir. Thanks for joining us today.
Thanks, Jesse. Have a great day.